This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Dr. Ashraf Mahate, Chief Economist for Trade and Economic Development in the Dubai Government, consultant in the areas of international trade, export promotion, inward investment attraction and entrepreneurship, Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and member on Studiosity's Academic Advisory Board.
Welcome to the Studiosity podcast. Today, I'm extremely excited to have a wonderful guest. My name is Dr. Ashraf Mahate, and today for our podcast, we have Professor Tod Laursen, who is the Chancellor of the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. Professor Tod, it's certainly a pleasure to have you here this morning.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ashraf. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I've gone through your profile. It's absolutely amazing. I think I'd like to start off by you telling us a little bit about your background and how you entered into the world of academia, because only very few of us actually enter this world. As a former academic, I can say this. So I'd love to know your journey to this wonderful world of academia.
So I grew up in the United States. I grew up in Western Oregon. And I think part of the answer perhaps to your question is that my father was an academic. My father was a structural engineer, taught civil engineering at Oregon State University. So I grew up somehow around academia. And my mother was an English teacher, interestingly. So it was kind of in our house in a way, but I think, one thing that was probably clearer to me at an earlier age than entering academia or the possibility of it was to be an engineer. I think, that's probably, something that I self-identified a little bit earlier. And so I ended up going to school in mechanical engineering. That was my idea of being different from my father. Father was a civil engineer. I was going to strike out my own path by being a mechanical engineer. So we could probably debate, how distinct that really was. But so I went to Oregon State, large publicly supported university. Really, I think exposed me or started to expose me to a broader world. And I ended up doing my graduate work at Stanford. And one of the things, obviously, when you transition from being an undergraduate to a graduate student is you maybe develop more ideas of where you'd like to specialize and what kind of work, might you be able to be most passionate about, make your biggest contributions in. For me, that was a field called computational mechanics. So I was interested in the algorithms behind simulation tools that engineers use. And so that was the work that I ended up doing at Stanford. And I was also employed a good amount of that time as an analyst at the National Laboratory at Lawrence Livermore. So I got kind of this nice combination, I suppose, of practical experience and academic experience when I lived in California. It was probably during those years where I sort of realized maybe my future was as an academic. And so when I finished my PhD, I spent most of my faculty career at Duke University. I went there straight after my PhD and spent almost 20 years there. Really loved the place and enjoyed the students there and enjoyed the research environment. It was quite formative, I think, for me. And sometimes life just presents you with opportunities. And that certainly happened for me. I wasn't looking to go anywhere. My wife and I, raised our children in Durham, North Carolina. Like a lot of academics, I lived an international life. I had lots of research collaborators around the world and spent chunks of time abroad. But if I'm honest, I really didn't so much consider until a fairly late stage the possibility of actually moving abroad. And so when the opportunity came along to be the founding president of Khalifa University, it was a little bit of a surprise. But it was an assignment that I really took to. I was chairing a department at Duke at the time, and as I said, not particularly looking to move, but I had the opportunity. I was offered the founding presidency in Abu Dhabi, and I ended up spending 8 years there. And a couple of things happened, I think. First of all, working in the UAE in general is very multicultural, and that's, I think, something that appeals not only to me, but I think to a lot of academics. A lot of us were raised, in environments like that, and it's where we feel comfortable, knowing people from all around the world, from different walks of life. And we definitely have that probably cubed or squared, in the UAE. It's very international in outlook. So I liked that a lot, and I liked the excitement of being involved with a startup university. So we spent, my wife and I spent 8 years in Abu Dhabi, and we ended up going back to New York State for 5 years. I was the chief academic officer for a while in the New York State system. And I actually was asked a similar question by a group of students here on campus a week or so ago, how I made my way into academic leadership. And one of the points I guess I made there was that sometimes even relatively late in life, you learn things about yourself. And I think the thing I learned in my SUNY days, as positive as an experience as it was in many ways, the thing that I really missed was being off of a college campus. The SUNY system, if you're not aware, is very large. We had almost 500,000 students when I was there. And the job of the provost of the system is not on a campus. It's sort of in the system office in Albany, New York. And so, I spent a lot of time traveling to campuses, at least until COVID happened. I spent a lot of time doing that. But I really missed that sort of, rhythm of a college campus, the exposure to students, the direct involvement in academic programs, that kind of thing. So sometimes maybe it's good to have an experience like that because it kind of reminds you what you're really passionate about. And so I was sort of open to other opportunities. And when the opportunity came to AUS a couple of years back, that was very attractive to me. I knew of its reputation from my time at Khalifa, and I've really enjoyed it here. It's a fantastic place. So I can't tell you that this trajectory was planned. I think one of my credos in life is that you should mostly not be thinking about the next job you want. You should be all about whatever job it is you're doing at the moment, and just enjoy it and trust that if you do it well, things will work out. And then I guess a corollary to that for me is to be open for surprises and maybe open to new types of experiences. So I didn't necessarily plan this trajectory, but I've really enjoyed it, and I've been fortunate to have a lot of interesting experiences along the way.
Yeah, it's certainly been a very fascinating journey. But being an economist, I can't tell you the difference between a chemical engineer or a mechanical engineer. And I have two daughters, and I try to get them to go into economics, and they refuse to be taught by me, which is quite interesting, and they refuse to go into economics. So I know the best planning and the best intention can change. But I want to touch on your leadership questions later. But before we do that, can you tell us about your current institution, and your perspective and your vision for this institution?
Sure. Well, so American University of Sharjah is 27 years old. So it was established in the late 90s, and the founder of the institution, at the time, and the president for the first 25 years was Sheikh Sultan Al-Qasimi, who's the ruler of Sharjah. And, I think that what AUS has evolved into, he, of course, deserves a tremendous amount of credit for. He's a learned man himself. He's got 2 earned PhDs. And he really, I think, aspired to a world-class, education for young people here that would have an international outlook to it and, would impart, cultural values, Islamic values, although it's not an Islamic university, but obviously we reflect that very, strongly in our culture here. But he really felt, I think, that well-roundedness in all walks of life was really important. And so one of the things he adopted pretty early on that we take very seriously here is a liberal arts core, to the undergraduate experience particularly. And so our, if you want to call them general education, requirements are actually a little bit more than is typical. Not only of other UAE universities, but even more than some of the American universities that I've been around who are liberal arts in nature. So we take this very seriously, and we think it's kind of a differentiating factor, whether we're talking about business or engineering or architecture, our students kind of have this different quality to them. They're spending 40 credit hours or so, something like a third of their earned credits here, learning about things that complement their desired area of focus. So I think that character is very important in what we do. We have 4 colleges. We have about 6,000 students, a little bit smaller in the spring than we are in the fall. But it's, very nearly our all-time high enrollment. I think there have been times where maybe we had a few hundred students more, but we have a very, healthy enrollment now. I think in terms of the next few years, the types of programs we'd like to grow, we're becoming more interdisciplinary, and I think you hear this from a lot of universities now, that many of the interesting research questions are sort of they're in those interstitial spaces between disciplines. And so, we're making a conscious effort through the research centers we set up to be responsive to that, to maybe attract future faculty members who, will sort of have that orientation for the work that they want to do. We're growing and modernizing all of our degree programs, but I think much of the growth is going to happen at the master's and PhD level. And we want that growth to sort of reflect that interdisciplinary focus. So it's a really interesting place. What I really like about it is, we're young enough that we still have faculty here and staff who were essentially founders of the place, or very close to it. And, I don't know if you've ever worked in an institution like that, but it kind of brings the level of commitment people have to the mission. It brings it to another level, right? If you've kind of helped build a place with your own 2 hands, that really makes a difference. And so we have this kind of nice character. We have a lot of folks like that who, understand the history very well, or committed to the mission. But of course, the other side of that too is, if you sort of do the math, those folks are getting pretty close to retirement, or in some cases are starting to retire. And so what this represents for us also is an opportunity to bring in new ideas, right? And younger scholars who are sort of working alongside these pioneering faculty members. And so it makes it an interesting place right now, and I'm really fortunate to be a part of it.
I mean, certainly an interesting place. I mean, I came to the UAE just a year or 2 after it was set up. And I've seen it grow and become, I think now, one of the most excellent universities in the region, and certainly made a wonderful name for itself. But what I want to go back is one step to when you were an undergraduate. And then you moved to a postgraduate, because when I was undergraduate, I didn't study much. But when I was a postgraduate, I learned a lot. And I tried to bring those teaching, of the way I was taught, into my classrooms and my lecture rooms. How was university for you, both as an undergraduate and as a postgraduate? And to what extent have you brought your own personal experiences in the way that you taught your lectures? Because I know now you're more into leadership, but when you were lecturing.
No, that's an interesting question. I think I have probably a little bit of a parallel with what you just said. For me, and I suspect maybe for many of us who go to university, high school was very easy. And so for me, I learned a lot. If I sort of go back to the way I looked when I entered university, I was a band kid when I was in high school. So, and I often tell people, and this is interesting actually, because my children, my wife and I have two sons, and they're both concert violinists. So they've done something completely different from, either my wife or my own experience. But I guess if we dig back, we both have, a love of music and a love of the arts. And I would actually say in many ways in high school, I learned as much or more from music than I did from my academic studies, because frankly speaking, I wasn't as good at it. And so I had to work harder at it. I learned many of my skills about leadership and teamwork and these kinds of things through band, through participating in, musical ensembles and so forth. So that was kind of, what I looked like when I went to college. And I think when I was in college, there's two things I would say. I mean, one is I was really challenged academically there. And then of course, when you go to graduate school, there's another level of that. So I think that was healthy for me. I also, and this is going to be one of those, old guy stories about, walking through 5 feet of snow to get to work every day, that kind of thing. But one thing about engineering school at the time I was in university is, in the United States at least, they used to quite commonly tell students, well, this is a 5-year program and you can finish it in 4 if you want, and that's not the attitude we take with parents or students anymore, and probably rightfully so, right? But the point was I was determined to finish in 4 years. So you had to really, take very heavy loads and work very hard to, do that. And, so for me, it was a good challenge, and I kind of looked at it that way. In terms of academics, one thing that was kind of shaped, so I went to a land-grant school. I went to Oregon State University, which prepared me phenomenally in many ways, but it was not a liberal arts institution and still is not. So it's kind of funny. I look back on myself and I, like a lot of college kids, I was just trying to do the right thing and didn't really have the full picture. But I was interested in things like history and literature and, and I took what I could, which wasn't very much actually. But it was, for me, it was really important as somebody who was serious about technology and wanted to do that. I somehow had this desire to exercise my brain in different ways. And so, I really found those kinds of courses, even though they were pretty much elective, I suppose we would call them gen ed requirements today, but I just looked at them as a way to sort of stretch myself in another direction. So I remember doing a lot of that kind of stuff. But, then my graduate work takes me to Stanford, and then ultimately my faculty career takes me to Duke. And I really see what that broader world could be, right? And so that made it especially important to me, as a faculty advisor, for example, to try to encourage my students to really take advantage of what was around them. I mean, when I was at Duke, I was like, how could you not, if you're an engineering student here, take advantage of one of the best econ departments in the world, one of the best political science programs in the world? It's all here for you, and you should take advantage of it. And I think we, one of the things that was really nice about working there is that we tended to attract students who wanted that kind of university experience. So I would say that was pretty formative for me, just because my own trajectory, was partly in almost the opposite, I would say, of a liberal arts type of setting. And then, so much of my experience was in that setting. And it's part of the reason, coming back to AUS, when the opportunity presented itself to come here as chancellor, why that was so attractive, because I sort of, had a career as both a student and a faculty member where I could see, this really does give you the opportunity to prepare students differently. And it's one of the things I really enjoyed about this place. And I've tried to bring that to the way I've taught classes. And when I became an administrator a little bit later, how we tried to work with our teams to create opportunities for faculty and students.
Wonderful. I believe, Professor Tod, you brought something with you. Would you like to show our guests what you brought?
I did. It's a little thing.
Ah, okay.
So it's a little thing. So, and I don't know, can you see this? So this is something my mother gave me to put on my first desk when I was joining the faculty at Duke. And it's made of myrtle wood. So if you've been on the West Coast and you've walked on the beach, you've probably seen this gnarled wood that sort of washes up, and it's sort of nicely polished, and I can clip papers to it and so forth. It says Oregon at the top, but mostly I keep it with me. I've had it on every desk I've had, the last 30 years or so, and I keep it with me because what Mom told me when she gave it to me was never forget where you're from. And I guess I never have. So it's a little thing, but it's one of those comforts from home that I enjoy having around me.
But those are valuable words, and I think we always should never forget where we're from. And we should not underestimate the journey that we're taking. And I think that's really valuable. Not forgetting your roots and not forgetting what your ambition and also what your mission is in each post. I would like to take this one step further and look at what is the style of leadership that you have, and what do you think is important as a leader of a university which is excellent reputation in a very dynamic environment?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things that I'd mention. One is that, I really do think that building teams is key to success. I think, and maybe this comment's a little bit specific to higher education, but I think one thing that the corporate sector and other sectors maybe underappreciate about higher education is its level of complexity. I think sometimes there's an assumption that running a university is like running a corporation, and I think there are certain habits from the corporate world that we can learn something from. Don't get me wrong. I think to be insular is not the answer either, but they are complicated places. I think they require some area expertise, and I think they're sufficiently complicated that you shouldn't have a very small number of people making key decisions. And so, one of the things that we did when I joined AUS was to enlarge the leadership team. We have several new vice chancellors, one for research. We have one for the student experience. We're currently looking for a new vice chancellor for external relations. Obviously, we have a provost. And we have one for financial affairs and administration too. And I don't know that structure is all that earth-shattering. You'll sort of see things like that in a lot of universities, but I think one of the things maybe that distinguishes really good places from okay ones is that their leadership teams tend to work very well together. And I think that you have to model that as the person in charge of being the chief executive. So that's something about me that, I feel like I've been successful everywhere I've been in trying to sort of build a true team culture. So I think, another thing that's very important in universities is sort of transparency and communication. And, this is something we're still working on, frankly. And I think maybe most universities have some version of this, but, I spent most of my professional career as a faculty member, and, I know how important it is. I think there's two things, right? One is that faculty are really the driving force of any institution. So you really have to kind of understand that and align the way you do your business and the way you hear from people, the way you engage them in certain activities, whether it's strategic planning or otherwise, needs to reflect that value that, the faculty are really the lifeblood of the institution. And so making sure you do a good job of communicating the key decisions that are being made, why you're making them, to get valuable input from smart people when you can, is really important. And so, that's something I think, people at AUS would say, that's something we need to improve for whatever reason. I think COVID is part of that story. I think that there is still a lot of value in seeing each other face to face. And when you have a long period of time where you don't, I think certain communication habits and collaborative habits suffer, at least in some places. And I think, not having been here, but kind of inheriting maybe what the place looked like a couple of years later, I think there were some sort of habits in terms of inclusivity that we kind of needed to get back to as an institution. So we're working hard on that. I think that's an important leadership characteristic. And I think the other thing I would probably mention here that's kind of personal in a way is I think if you're an academic leader, you're going to be in a position where you're asking people to do hard things. And we're effectively, as an institution, our reputation was built largely on undergraduate education. People knew that we had a strong faculty. People knew that there was good scholarship happening here, not to trivialize any of that. But I think that the reputation of AUS was built largely on the quality of our undergraduate academic programs. And so now we're in an era where we want to maintain that quality, but we also want to be more of a research presence. And that is asking a lot of faculty. That is asking that, it's a bigger ask and a different ask than we were making when we hired a faculty member 20 years ago, right? So what helps in kind of making that request? Some of it is we have to resource them differently. We have to look at the size of the faculty. We have to make sure that workloads are commensurate with the expectations we have. All of that's true. But the other thing, just sort of practically speaking, is it helps a lot if you've actually done this yourself. If you're the leader of the organization and people know, well, this fellow actually has an academic record and has gotten sponsored research and has managed to, win teaching awards and still have an impactful research program, you have a little bit more credibility with faculty when you ask them to do these hard things, if that's somehow in your experience, than if you don't. And I mean, that's kind of where we are in AUS right now, but in different institutions, it was a different setting when I was at Khalifa University. We were a startup institution at that time, but still the same comment applies that we had the vision from the beginning in that case that we were going to be a research intensive institution. And so when the leader of that institution comes from a research intensive background and has done many of the things that he or she is talking about themselves, that makes a difference. And so I think that's just kind of a practical thing about leadership that really helps quite a bit when you're trying to navigate a change like we're going through now.
No, so I totally agree with you. And I really love the idea that you brought up, which is that universities are different because they're not essentially profit-making organizations.
Right.
And you're actually managing very, very smart people
right.
who are quite eminent in their own fields.
Right.
And that brings out its own challenges. And of course, you're now reached the next stage of your development, where you now need to focus more on research and getting research output increased. But I'd like to go back to, and one of the things you said was that you were a faculty for a long part of your career, right? So what was important to you as an educator? And were there any specific opportunities that you took advantage of, or ideas that you enacted on?
Yeah, sure. Well, a few things, and I kind of alluded to it briefly earlier. From my undergraduate experience, I could tell that um, sort of a subdiscipline of mechanical engineering. Some places you find it in civil engineering, some places you find it in aerospace, but this sort of notion of mathematically from a computer science perspective, how do you put together algorithms that people will actually use to make physical predictions of whether a building is strong enough or whether an airplane design will work or whatever it is. I was just fascinated by the physics behind that, and the idea of, how do you build effective numerical approximations? How can you tell that they're accurate? Um, so one of the experiences, and as I say, I didn't premeditate maybe a lot of this stuff. So I kind of bumped into things along the way that provided course corrections. And one of the things I think I knew coming out of school that somehow this was probably where I wanted to, spend my career, and somehow it was what I was good at. Although it's funny, I was telling the students last week that the first structural models that I made as an undergraduate student were on punch cards. And of course, most of them had never seen a punch card or even knew what it was, right? So I guess I'm dating myself a little bit here, but that I had enough exposure as a young engineer to know that that was what I wanted to do. But I think some things, maybe partially unintentionally, that happened to me that really helped. I mentioned that I was an analyst at Lawrence Livermore for a while, and as a student engineer, you hire on as an entry-level engineer in a research laboratory. One of the things you're asked to do is to do analyses in support of designs that people want to do. And that was tremendously helpful, just from an applied perspective, to know how these computer models were actually used in practice and how they could fail. And, from a practical point of view, how you improve approximations or tell that, if your prediction doesn't match the experiment, which it hardly ever does, how do you track that down, right? How do you figure out what's the shortcoming in your model, or what's the thing happening in the experiment that you're not, accounting for properly, whatever it is. This sort of very applied setting of how these tools are actually used. So then I go off to Stanford full time to do my PhD, having had this experience. And I one of the things that was hard about graduate school is I had to learn a lot of applied math. So I was, I think, a very intuitive engineer, and it wasn't that I didn't have mathematics skills, but I hadn't had those developed much beyond, a sort of really rigorous undergraduate engineering curriculum. And now you're at Stanford and you're with a lot of European and Middle Eastern graduate students who basically had taken math on the undergraduate level, and you had to catch up. And so it became very theoretical very quickly. But the advantage I felt like I had, and I kind of discovered this over time, and I think it translated into my faculty career too, is because I had spent a little bit of time as a working analyst using these tools, these codes. I had a better than average understanding of how theoretical work would translate into something that would have impact in the engineering world. And if you're sitting at a university and now you want to get an NSF grant or you want to get an NIH grant to support your work, you're not going to get it without being able to describe that. So for me, it was kind of organic, but getting that combination over time of good practical experience from one point of view, but then enough theoretical sophistication to really do something new. That was helpful to me in my career. And I will say that the sort of making new theoretical contributions, some of them pretty fundamental, but all of them things that could be implemented in codes and used. That was a process I really enjoyed. Now, look, there was one thing I missed, and I was when I was speaking to this same group of students a week or so ago. Again, maybe this lesson that you need to learn things along the way a little bit. I'm in the situation now where I look at it, and most of the major commercial finite element codes I'm aware of use at least some of the algorithms that came out of my group at various times. Did I protect any of that IP? No. Was I smart enough to even think about that? No. So part of the advice I'm giving students is, it's never too early to think about those things. And when you have the opportunity as a young academic or as a student to, sort of learn a little bit about filing invention disclosures and things like that, maybe that's not the worst thing in the world to do. It just wasn't in my headspace. That wasn't the way I was thinking. And part of it was the research culture I grew up in too, if I'm honest. I mean, I think my technical community, maybe this is still true to a degree, but certainly when I was coming up, our publishing habits were such that, it was kind of a mutual expectation that, if you had a new algorithm and you wanted to, publish that and let people know about it, there would be enough information in the paper that somebody who liked your results could go off and implement what you'd done, right? And so that was kind of the way I was trained to write my scholarly work, and that was what I did. That's not necessarily inconsistent with being intentional about protecting your IP, but I just wasn't sophisticated enough in my thinking at that time or prioritizing that or whatever to do it. So I guess that's my story, or at least my first blush reaction to your question. That combination of theoretical and applied in my own career was something I really enjoyed and felt like I could make novel contributions at, and was able to do that ultimately.
I mean, that's very common among academics, is to pursue the curiosity. And while pursuing the curiosity, they, of course, have to publish. So they actually forget the whole intellectual property rights aspect. And,
right.
And of course, the business community is far more astute, and they're able to capitalize, as you mentioned. And I think that's perhaps something that academics generally need to be more aware of, is how to protect their output. But then also, I think that goes against the grain of what is an academic. I mean, the idea of an academic is really to pursue knowledge, right? To pursue questions, to pursue curiosity, not as a financial engine. That, I think, is really more for the business community. But the linkages between the university and the business are quite important. And how you marry the two together. So academics can carry on publishing, can carry on pursuing research, but businesses who are far more astute, who are far more aware of how to protect technology, far more aware of getting a concept into a proof of concept, commercializing it, and then perhaps licensing it, is really more their forte. One of the things you mentioned is that you're focusing more on research. So is this the kind of thing that you're looking to do, is build more relationships with industry, so your academics can produce, businesses in Sharjah or in the UAE can benefit from the knowledge and create this kind of very important technology-based linkage?
Yeah, that's right. And it's, we have an advantage here that we're kind of thinking about this in a greater Sharjah sense. As you and your listeners will know, we have another major university in Sharjah as well, which is University of Sharjah, right next door. We have a research and technology park that's right next door. We also have entrepreneurship authority, Sharjah, here in Sharjah, that is part of that interface between, let's say, the venture capital world and the world of invention and startups. So we're trying to sort of attack this collaboratively, all of us. And I think, from AUS's perspective, The thing that's important, well, there's a piece of good news, for example, and we just have to make sure that we serve students well. So one of the things we do as an institution periodically is administer, and this is an American survey, it's the student engagement survey. And it's something universities do. It enables them to kind of benchmark a little bit against, what their peers and we ask students questions like how you spend your time and how much time do you study per week and on what, and how much does your curriculum make you write, all of these sorts of questions. So obviously when I came in, this had just been administered at AUS, and I was very interested in the results because I just wanted to get to know our students a little bit better. And one of the things I found really interesting here is that, our students' desire to be involved in startup and entrepreneurship activities is about 50% higher than the American university comparators that we use in this survey. So this is something students want to do. I mean, and maybe that's, given Dubai's right next door, and Abu Dhabi's not that far away either, and all of the activities that are happening in the country, maybe that shouldn't be a huge surprise. So this is in our students' DNA to want to do this, and I think it kind of makes it an imperative for us to figure out ways where that will happen. So that's happened inside the curriculum. There is a required, as is true across the UAE, there's a required entrepreneurship course that is offered in junior year that everybody takes. We have other cross-cutting opportunities within our general education curriculum for students who want to maybe even focus more, on that sort of entrepreneurship to be able to do that. We have programs. One of the things we did with Sharjah, the entrepreneurship arm of the Sharjah government, is we gave them space right next to our library, right in the middle of campus. And so they do seminars there. They try to sort of keep entrepreneurship in front of our students. The other thing that they've started to do is they'll attend things like student design competitions in our engineering school every year, and they'll cherry pick the best projects. And what they offer are a series of programs which they call Dojo, that are typically summer programs. And that's where they, and students, of course, have to apply to it. They have to sort of bring an idea for something that they would maybe want to translate into a company. And they give them training on how to do that. And there are even opportunities after students and teams of students, which is actually more typical. They usually do it in teams. They actually have the opportunity to compete for investments, and we gather investors together and do pitch events and these kinds of things. So we're trying to work together with our partners to create more opportunities of this type. One of the things that's coming, and just so we don't be overly technically focused in the way we think about this, one of the things I find really interesting about our mix of programs here is I think we have the finest architecture school in the region. I think most people feel that that's true. Now, if you think about what that actually means, if you graduate with a bachelor's in architecture, you're almost certainly, probably more often than not, you're going to end up freelancing, at least for some period of time. You may have the aspiration to work for one of the big famous firms, and they may be interested in taking you on. And we certainly prepare students who do that. But I think many of the sort of up and coming architectural outfits in Dubai and Sharjah and in the UAE are actually run by AUS graduates who did them as startups, right? So one of the interesting needs we're trying to respond to collectively now, and we'll, I think, have something to announce soon, but we're actually doing something with the research park that is going to cater specifically to creative industries, whether you're talking about architecture or, in our case, media studies is very popular, visual arts are in there somewhere. Many of these disciplines are the same breed of cat, if you want to put it that way, where kind of having some basic entrepreneurial skills, providing ways to accelerate the networking that people need to do. So these are all things we're engaged in, but in my mind, it kind of comes back to, what our students increasingly want to do when they come. I mean, I think this is one of the things maybe it's important to understand is that this generation is different from ours in terms of what they expect when they come to university, right? And so this is, I think, an example of an expectation. Another one is sustainability, right? Just don't want to go to a campus that doesn't care about that. I mean, that's for them, that's kind of an expectation that this is important to me. I would like to play a role in preserving the planet in whatever form, clean water, global warming, whatever that might be. And not only do they want to learn more about that when they're in university, but they want to have opportunities to sort of exercise those passions. So I think that's a really cool thing about the generation of students we're serving now, and something that we try to be responsive to.
And that's fascinating. I like your description of the orange economy, because I certainly think the orange or the creative economy is certainly extremely important. And I think that will be a separate show that we'll have to do later in the year, where we can discuss this particular sector in more detail, because I think it's the one area that this region can make a huge difference.
Yeah.
And also like that, the triangle that you've got with the university, the businesses, and the funding. I think that's a wonderful model. And of course, getting a share of the enterprise wing of Sharjah government into the university. I think one of the things that I've found in my own teaching in the area is that students here want to be entrepreneurs. And you're right, it's a different generation. We were the generation who went for employment. I think this is the generation that wants greater control over their life, and wants to be an employer rather than employee. I think entrepreneurship is extremely important. But something else which I think is equally important, and it's a phrase that I hear at every conference, every seminar, every workshop, and I think it's inescapable, which is artificial intelligence. Right? I'd like to know your perspective of artificial intelligence in higher education, and how AUS is capitalizing on the opportunities.
Yeah, well, I think, if we're really honest with each other, we're still figuring that out, just like society, is as a whole. But I think, many of the first order things that universities, have thought about and have reacted to this wave by doing, we've done too. I mean, we felt it was important to, as a starting point at least, to get some policies in place that would provide students and faculty with guidance about ethical uses of AI, what's okay, what's not okay, how professors should communicate that, in the course of leading a class. I think that guidance itself will probably change and evolve over time, but I think, that's a much more productive strategy than denying the existence of this or being scared of it. I mean, it's going to happen, right? It is happening. And it's quite pervasive. I mean, anytime you get a software upgrade now on your iPhone or whatever, right? You've all of a sudden got new capabilities in your hand that you didn't have, 3 months ago. So I think we're thinking institutionally about, access to, making sure that quality access to good tools is available to our students and faculty. I think that we've tried in our Center of Teaching and Learning, we've tried to, provide more programming that sort of allows our faculty who have success stories, ways that they've used AI in the disciplines, to sort of share that expertise with their faculty colleagues, and try to raise the level a little bit of everybody's sophistication here. But it's a tough job. I think I think one of our challenges is there's a big gap between, and most, I think, institutions will tell you this, there's a big gap between the level of usage of our students and the level of usage of our faculty. And we have to try to close that gap because our students are, early adopters to all of these technologies. This has always been true. This was true of our generation too. It's just that the technologies were different, right? So I think we are playing catch up a little bit. So I think, on the ground, this is a very, this is a very important topic, and I think adaptivity of an organization, the ability to sort of, try to sort of anticipate trends, be willing to try things out, is quite important. But I also think that there is occasionally a risk of this being overblown a bit. And I won't exactly equate it, to the MOOC phenomenon for a few years ago, but MOOCs were clearly overblown. I mean, it was, if you remember the story when Coursera and other people were being established and people were jumping into this, and they were saying, well, the need for the bricks and mortar university is going to go away, and this is, and clearly nothing of that type happened, but that technology is still really influential, right? And and I was actually at Duke when Duke did its first sort of baby steps with Coursera, and there are not a massive number of Duke courses that are delivered online that used to be delivered on-prem, right? I mean, but what there is now is much better sort of complementary information available to students because of the existence of entities like Coursera, where I had a physics professor describe this to me once, who participated in one of these pilots, and he said, the great thing about this is that I could be giving a lecture in physics now, and everybody is not madly trying to take notes and follow every detail. He says, I can actually catch their eyes because they know that everything's being captured. They don't have to write everything down. So when they get out of the lecture 50 minutes from now, they can go back to their dorm room, watch the things they missed, fill up any gaps that, but in the meantime, I can actually engage them, in a different way than I could before. So it wasn't that the whole sort of MOOC or online education thing was wrong. And look, I mean, it in many ways saved our skin during COVID. The fact that we had more capability along this line really helped us adapt, to a really bad situation a few years ago. So, AI, I think, is more fundamental than that. I mean, in a way, but I think, think about the things that, particularly as a liberal arts institution, we're trying to teach people to do. We're trying to teach to ask the right questions. We're trying to teach them or help them on their journey to be better critical thinkers. We're trying to teach them to evaluate a model, whether it's an economic model or whatever it might be, and sort of relate that to assumptions and make an assessment of, whether it's valid or not. Is AI going to replace any of those things? No, right? Is the way we're going to do those things going to change because of AI? Almost certainly, right? So I think maybe another way to think about this is sort of in the workplace. Jobs are going to change, right? But I think mediocrity in a non-AI world and mediocrity in an AI world are going to have the same result. If you're just, for example, using AI to write your next term paper faster, there's nothing in that process that's going to improve your employability or your attractiveness to employers. But if you're the person who really understands how this technology can do something different, and you've developed your analytical skills to the point where you can really systematically apply these technologies in whatever field you work in, you're going to have a competitive advantage. And so, I think the way we do a lot of education will change, but I think a lot of the fundamental tenets that we hope to provide students, the goals won't necessarily change. The way we do the work quite likely will.
I totally agree with you, because when I look at the history of technology over the last 5 decades, when we had the calculator for the first time in exams, the whole idea was, well, it's going to make students less educated, less able to understand maths, but it didn't. It just made the syllabus more difficult. We were able to do more complex questions. When we had computers, we could do multiple regressions. Because I remember when I was in university, we had to do linear regressions with just 5 data points. It's very different. So I think AI will certainly change the educational landscape, and will probably make us better critical thinkers. And I also agree with you in the sense that a lot of academic institutions are finding their way. Technology is changing extremely fast. And old academics like us need to catch up with students who are far more able and far more talented. My own daughters teach me how to use AI, and I had little knowledge of it. And that's the pace that we're talking about. I realize we're running out of time, but I'd like to ask you one question, which is, what advice would you give to your younger self? And what would you say to aspiring faculty and university leaders? What advice would you give them?
Well, I guess, so I already told you a bit about my sons, or our sons, my wife and my sons. And, I guess I would like to think that I had the opportunity, in terms of things I would have said to my younger self. In a way, I had the chance to do that with both of them, which was, whatever field, whatever pursuit you want after, in your university career and after that, is fine by us. I didn't, Jennifer and I did not want our kids, worried about our expectations. I mean, that happens anyway. I mean, I think many kids, and mine are no different, go through phases where maybe they're too concerned about what their parents think. We tried to do everything we could to maybe avoid that and to free them up, but we told them that our expectation is, whatever you pick, you have to be all in. You have to be passionate about it. You probably, especially if you're going to go into a field like music, your goal can't be to just be okay. You have to be really good, to survive even in that field. And if that's what you want to do, we're 100% behind you. So, I think my parents did that for me. I wasn't necessarily all that conscious of it at the time. It's maybe one of the things that I worry about sometimes. And, I had student engineers like this at every institution I've taught at, including AUS, who, and it's a hazard in this part of the world, because engineering is very prestigious here. Many parents, particularly if their children show quantitative talent, will put a lot of pressure on them to study engineering. And I've had countless engineering students in many educational systems who, it's pretty clear, and they will tell you that they're there primarily because their parents want them to be there, right? And so it's not the way I would do it, but you can't always project that on other people. But I think it's really important for, anybody as a young person trying to sort of find their way. You have to somehow figure out a way to find your passion, because if you don't do that, it's kind of hard to ever be completely satisfied. No matter how good you are, at whatever it is you end up doing. If you're not passionate about it, if you don't see the value in it, if you don't feel fulfilled by it, at some point life becomes difficult. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing I often tell students is, whatever that passion is, if you find a way where you're serving others, then you never have to worry about a purposeless existence, right? You'll always have purpose in what you're doing if you can see that whatever it is you choose to do has benefit to other people. And so I think that's also a worthwhile thing, maybe when people are facing decisions about what my future is going to be like. I think that sense of purpose, that sense of service is maybe a helpful guide in figuring out, how you can best make your contribution.
I really love that. The two P's, passion and purpose.
Right.
I think that's wonderful advice because we have a lot of students also listening to this podcast. And I think that's wonderful advice. Follow your passion, have a purpose in life and in society. Wonderful words. I wish we had more time, Professor Tod, but we'll have to have another conversation late in the year regarding your entrepreneurial activities and of course the orange economy, which I'm quite interested in myself. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Tod.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and look forward to a future conversation at some point. That would be great.
You have been listening to Studiosity's podcast, Reimagining Higher Education, candid conversations within higher education, sharing stories of leadership, change, and best practice in teaching and learning. Visit studiosity.com.